Hello and welcome to her revenge arc. My name is Alara, and tonight I want to tell you a story. It is my story. It is not a tale told in the heat of anger or in the throes of sorrow. It is a story I have held on to, polished by time, until it shines with the cold, clear light of understanding. It's a story about the deceptive weight of love, the crushing pressure of legacy, and the quiet power of a single sentence, tucked away where no one thought to look. It is a story about how I was asked to sign away my future, and how, in agreeing, I secured it more completely than anyone could have ever imagined. So find a comfortable place and listen. It begins, as so many stories of ruin do, with a love that felt like salvation. Before I met Julian Ashworth, my world was one of quiet order and profound history. I am an archivist, a keeper of stories far older than my own. My days were spent in the hushed halls of the city's Central Historical Society, my hands, often protected by thin cotton gloves, brushing away the dust of decades from forgotten letters, faded photographs, and brittle documents that held the echoes of lives lived and lost. I found solace in the tangible past. My own history was simple, defined by a deep and abiding love for my father, a retired professor of literature who raised me alone after my mother passed away when I was a child. He filled our small book-lined apartment with warmth, intellectual curiosity, and the unwavering belief that my worth was intrinsic, not something to be bestowed upon me by others. My world was small perhaps, but it was solid. It was real. I met Julian not at a loud bar or a bustling party, but at a rare book auction. It was a place I frequented not to bid me archivist's salary would barely cover the cost of the catalog, but to be near the artifacts. I loved to watch history change hands. That evening, a collection of handwritten letters from a lesser-known 19th-century poet was on the block. I was absorbed, tracing the phantom shapes of the ink on the page from my seat in the back row. "They're remarkable, aren't they?" a voice said, low and smooth, next to me. I turned. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost classical, with a strong jawline, thoughtful dark eyes, and a suit that was so perfectly tailored it seemed to be a part of him. He wasn't looking at me, but at the letters displayed on the screen at the front of the room. "The way she speaks of the sea," I murmured, caught off guard. "It's not as an observer. It's as if she's in a conversation with it." He finally turned his gaze to me, and a slow smile spread across his face. It was a genuine, captivating smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "That's it exactly. Everyone else just sees a coastline. She sees a confidant." That was the beginning. His name was Julian Ashworth, and he was the one who ultimately won the bid for the letters. He didn't do it with a bombastic, attention-grabbing gesture, but with a quiet, decisive nod to the auctioneer that spoke of effortless power. After the auction, he found me by the refreshments table. He told me his family were collectors, but he bought the letters because my passion for them had made him see them in a new light. He wanted to learn more. Our courtship was a whirlwind, but a gentle one. It was a whirlwind of museum dates, long walks through the city's oldest neighborhoods where I would point out architectural details no one else noticed, and quiet evenings in my apartment, surrounded by my father's books, where he would listen, truly listen, as I spoke of my work. He was fascinated by my world, a world he said was built on substance and meaning, a stark contrast to his own, which he hinted was often built on appearance and obligation. Julian was from a world entirely alien to me. The Ashworths were old money, a name that appeared on buildings, in financial reports, and on the patrons' lists of every major cultural institution in the city. Their wealth was not loud and flashy, but deep, entrenched, and powerful. Julian, however, seemed different. He was humble, almost apologetic about his privilege. He spoke of wanting to do something more meaningful with his life, perhaps philanthropy focused on historical preservation. He saw my passion not as a quaint hobby, but as a noble pursuit. He made me feel seen not for what I could be, but for what I already was. My father adored him. He saw in Julian a kind heart and a sharp mind. They would spend hours discussing everything from Roman history to contemporary fiction, my father's eyes sparkling with the joy I hadn't seen so brightly in years. For the first time since my mother's death, our small world of two felt like it could comfortably, happily expand to three. I fell in love with Julian deeply and completely. I loved his gentle nature, his intellectual curiosity, and the way he seemed to provide a calm harbor in the often chaotic sea of modern life. When he proposed 6 months later, on a trip to the coast that the poet from the letters had written about, it felt like the most natural, perfect culmination of our story. On a windswept cliff, with the salty air on our faces, he knelt and told me that I was his anchor, the one who connected him to something real and true. I said yes without a moment's hesitation, my heart so full I thought it might burst. The diamond on my finger felt less like a status symbol and more like a promise of a shared future. A future I believed would be built on the foundation of mutual respect and love we had so carefully constructed. I was naive. I believed our love was a sovereign nation. I had not yet learned that it was merely a small, unprotected territory about to be annexed by a far greater power. His family. The first tremor that shook the foundations of my perfect world was the meeting with his parents, Eleanor and Richard Ashworth. The meeting wasn't arranged as a casual get-together, but as a formal summons. Mother and father would like to host a dinner for us at the estate on Sunday, Julian had announced, a slight, almost imperceptible tension in his voice. The estate. It wasn't a house. It was a sprawling stone testament to generational wealth, set on acres of manicured land that seemed to hold the surrounding countryside at bay. As we drove up the long, winding driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees that stood like silent, judgmental sentinels, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in my stomach. The house itself loomed at the end of the drive, its grand facade and countless dark windows looking less like a home and more like a mausoleum for a dynasty. Julian squeezed my hand. "Don't be nervous. They're going to love you." He said it with the conviction of a man trying to convince himself as much as me. Eleanor and Richard Ashworth were waiting for us in the grand foyer. The room was cavernous, with the marble floor so polished I could see my own anxious reflection in it. A massive, imposing portrait of a stern-faced ancestor hung over the grand staircase, his eyes seeming to follow me. Eleanor Ashworth was tall, rail-thin, and impeccably dressed in a severe navy blue dress. Her silver hair was styled in a flawless chignon, and her face was a mask of polite, aristocratic composure. There was not a hint of warmth in her eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, and they scanned me from head to toe with the cool, dispassionate appraisal of a jeweler inspecting a stone for flaws. "Ilara," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of inflection. She did not offer a hand, but a slight, almost regal nod. "Julian has told us a great deal about you." The slight pause before "a great deal" was a masterpiece of subtle condescension, implying that what he had told them was likely insufficient or perhaps uninteresting. Richard Ashworth was a quieter presence, but no less intimidating. He was a portly man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He stood slightly behind his wife, a silent partner in her reign. He gave me a curt nod and a grunt that was meant to pass as a greeting. The dinner was an ordeal. It was a carefully orchestrated interrogation disguised as polite conversation. The dining room was immense, the table so long I felt miles away from Julian, who sat beside his father, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "So, Ilara," Eleanor began, delicately cutting into a piece of fish I couldn't identify. "You work with old papers?" "I'm an archivist at the city's historical society," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I preserve and catalog historical documents." "How quaint," she said, and the word hung in the air like a poisonous insect. "A hobby, then? Something to keep you occupied?" "It's my career, Mrs. Ashworth," I clarified, my back stiffening. "I have a master's degree in archival studies." "Of course," she said with a thin, dismissive smile, as if my degree was a little trinket I'd picked up at a market. "Richard, isn't it wonderful that young women have such pastimes these days? In my day, a woman's focus was on building a home, supporting her husband's ambitions, and securing the family's legacy." Her eyes met mine across the table, and the message was unmistakable. "You are a pastime. I am a legacy." Richard grunted in agreement. "Legacy is everything. It's what separates us from everyone else. It's not about money, you understand," he said, in the way only a man for whom money was no object ever could. "It's about bloodline. It's about ensuring that what our great-grandfather built continues. Undiluted. The word undiluted struck me like a physical blow. They were talking about me. My bloodline. My simple middle-class background. My father, the professor. I was the dilution. They asked about my family. When I told them about my father, the professor of literature, Eleanor's lips tightened. An academic. How lovely. I suppose a life of the mind is a comfort when one lacks other resources. Every sentence was a veiled insult. A meticulously crafted dart aimed at my background, my career, my worth. I looked to Julian for support, but he was staring at his plate, his jaw tight. He offered no defense, no correction. He just sat there, a silent, captive prince in his parents' cold kingdom. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was the chilling realization that the wonderful, independent man I had fallen in love with ceased to exist within these walls. Here he was just their son, and their son was their property. The evening ended with Eleanor walking me to the door, her hand resting lightly on my arm in a gesture that felt more like a claim than a comfort. "Julian is a good boy," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But he is sensitive. He has a great destiny ahead of him, a great responsibility to this family. He needs a wife who understands that her role is to facilitate that destiny, not to distract from it with her own small ambitions." As we drove away from the estate, the silence in the car was heavy and suffocating. I finally broke it. "Julian, your parents. They're a bit formal," he interrupted, his eyes fixed on the road. "They just take some getting used to. That's how they are with everyone." "No, Julian," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "That's not how they are with everyone. That's how they are with me. Your mother called my career a quaint hobby. Your father talked about not diluting the family bloodline. They were incredibly insulting." He sighed, a long, weary sound. "You're being too sensitive, Alara. That's just their way. They're from a different generation. They don't mean anything by it." "They meant everything by it," I whispered, turning to look out the window at the dark trees rushing past. But I didn't say it to him. I said it to myself. That dinner was the beginning of a subtle, insidious campaign waged by Eleanor Ashworth. She began to call me for weekly chats. These calls were never overtly hostile, but they were exercises in psychological warfare. She would offer helpful suggestions about my wardrobe, implying it was too plain. She'd inquire about my friends, asking if they were the right sort of people for the future Mrs. Ashworth to be seen with. She sent me a subscription to a magazine that focused on society gossip and charity balls, with a little note. "I thought you might find this educational." She was trying to sand down my edges, to erase the woman Julian had fallen in love with, and replace her with a polished, compliant doll who would fit neatly into the Ashworth family display case. Julian remained willfully blind. He saw his mother's actions as misguided attempts at bonding. He saw her criticisms as a form of caring. "She's just trying to help you adjust, darling," he would say, stroking my hair, his touch no longer feeling like a comfort, but like an anesthetic. The love I felt for him began to curdle with the slow, creeping dread. I loved the man he was with me in our world, but I was beginning to understand that our world was a fragile bubble, and his family's world, with all its cold, hard-edged legacy, was the pin poised to burst it. The proposal on the cliff had felt like the beginning of a beautiful story. Now I feared it was only the prologue to a tragedy, and I was being cast in a role I had no desire to play. The final illusion of our shared future shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a crisp autumn day, and the leaves outside the window of Julian's sleek, minimalist apartment were a riot of red and gold. It felt like a cruel irony that the world could look so beautiful when mine was about to be rendered in shades of gray. Julian had been tense all morning. He'd asked me to take the afternoon off work, saying there was something important we needed to discuss with his parents. I had assumed it was about wedding plans, a topic Eleanor had completely commandeered. I pictured another grueling conversation about guest lists and floral arrangements. I was wrong. It was so much worse. We weren't summoned to the estate. Instead, we were directed to a sterile, intimidating office in the financial district. The name on the frosted glass door read, Ashworth, Sterling and Finch Private Wealth Management. This was not a place for family chats. This was a place for transactions. We were led into a conference room dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the grim set of my own face. Richard and Eleanor were already seated, looking as implacable as stone statues. Beside them sat a man in a severe suit who could only be a lawyer. He had the pale, bloodless look of someone who spent his life in air-conditioned rooms, dissecting joy and turning it into clauses. Julian sat beside me, but he wouldn't meet my eye. He just stared at a carafe of water in the center of the table, as if it held the secrets to the universe. There were no pleasantries. Eleanor came straight to the point, her voice as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "Elara," she began, "as you know, the Ashworth family has a significant legacy to protect. It is a legacy that has been built over generations, through careful planning and foresight. A marriage is not just a union of two hearts. It is a merger of two lives, two futures. And in a situation such as this, where there is a significant disparity in assets, it is only prudent to have certain agreements in place." The lawyer, whose name was Mr. Finch, slid a thick, leather-bound document across the table toward me. It landed with a soft, final thud in front of me. "This," Richard said, speaking for the first time, his voice a low rumble, "is the prenuptial agreement. It is standard procedure. Non negotiable." I stared at the document. Prenuptial agreement. The word seemed to mock me. I finally looked at Julian, a desperate, silent plea in my eyes. "Say something. Stop this. This isn't us." He just gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, his gaze still fixed on the table. He was a prisoner, and he had just shown me the bars of his cage. My hands were trembling as I opened the document. I started to read. It was not a legal document. It was a scroll of humiliation. It was a systematic dismantling of my identity, my autonomy, and my worth. It began with the financials, which were as brutal as expected. I was to waive any and all claim to any Ashworth asset, be it property, stocks, trusts, or art. This applied not only to assets they currently held, but any asset they might acquire in the future. In the event of a divorce, I would be entitled to a one-time lump sum payment. I scanned down to the figure. It was a paltry sum, less than my annual salary, a calculated insult designed to remind me of my station. But the financial clauses were the least of it. It was the lifestyle clauses that truly took my breath away. Clause 7 stipulated that I must maintain a physical appearance and body weight deemed appropriate by the Ashworth family. It even included a specific weight range I was not to exceed. Clause 9C required me to submit a monthly budget of my personal spending for Eleanor's approval. Any expenditure over a certain amount required her prior written consent. Clause 12 detailed my social obligations. I was required to attend a minimum of 40 charitable and social events per year, chosen by Eleanor. My own social life was to be curtailed, with a list of unsuitable acquaintances to be provided. My friends, the people who had supported me my whole life, were deemed unsuitable. My career, the thing that gave me purpose and identity, was addressed in Clause 15. I was to resign from my position at the Historical Society within 3 months of the wedding. My new role, the document stated, was as a support to my husband and a manager of the domestic household. But the cruelest cut, the one that made me feel sick to my stomach, was Clause 18, the infidelity clause. It stated that in the event of proven infidelity on my part, I would forfeit even the pitiful lump sum payment and leave the marriage with nothing. There was no corresponding clause for Julian. His fidelity, it seemed, was not a matter of contractual obligation. I felt the blood drain from my face. Every line I read was a fresh wound. This document was not about protecting their assets. It was about owning me. It was a contract for my surrender. They weren't just asking me to sign a paper. They were asking me to sign away myself, piece by painful piece. I slowly closed the leather binder. The room was silent, the air thick with unspoken cruelty. I looked at Eleanor's smug, composed face. I looked at Richard's cold, calculating eyes. And then I looked at the man I thought I loved. "Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He finally looked at me. His eyes were filled with a miserable, desperate conflict. "Elara," he began, his voice cracking. It's just a formality. Piece of paper. It won't change anything between us." "A piece of paper?" I echoed, my voice gaining a tremor of disbelief and rising anger. "A piece of paper that dictates my weight, Julian? That tells me who my friends can be? That forces me to quit my job? That puts a price on my dignity? This isn't a piece of paper. This is a list of terms for my unconditional surrender. And you're just sitting here letting them do this. What do you want me to do?" he hissed back, his desperation turning to defensiveness. "This is my family. This is how it's always been. This is bigger than me, it's bigger than us." "No," I said, my voice suddenly clear and cold. The tremor was gone, replaced by a terrifying clarity. "There is nothing bigger than us. There shouldn't be. I thought that's what we were building. But I was wrong." Eleanor cleared her throat, a sharp, impatient sound. "We are not here to debate the finer points of youthful sentimentality. This is a business matter. You will, of course, want your own legal counsel to review the document. Formality, of course. We have a list of pre-approved attorneys you can choose from." Of course they did. Attorneys who were on their payroll, who would pat me on the head and tell me this was all perfectly standard for people of their stature. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. Every eye was on me. "I will have my lawyer look at it," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. I picked up the heavy document. It felt like a tombstone in my hands. "You'll be hearing from them." I walked out of that room without looking back at Julian. I walked out of the building and into the beautiful autumn afternoon. But I couldn't feel the sun on my skin. I felt a coldness that had settled deep in my bones. The love I had for Julian, the beautiful, vibrant thing I had cherished, had died in that conference room. It had been suffocated by the weight of his legacy, his weakness, and a humiliating prenuptial agreement. I wept on the taxi ride home. I wept for the man I thought he was, and for the fool I had been. But as the tears dried, something else began to take root in the barren soil of my heart. It was not hope. It was a cold, hard, and patient resolve. They wanted me to sign a document. Fine. I would sign. But it would be a document of my own making. The days that followed were a blur of hollow emptiness. Julian called, texted, even showed up at my apartment, his face etched with a pain that I now recognized as self-pity, not remorse. He brought flowers, apologies, and endless justifications. "It's just to appease them, Elara," he'd plead through the closed door. "Once we're married, it will all be different. The paper will mean nothing. I love you, not their money." But his words were meaningless. He had shown me his true allegiance in that conference room. His love for me was conditional, a luxury he could afford only when it didn't conflict with his primary duty, which was to his family. The man I loved wouldn't have asked me to endure that humiliation. He would have stood up and walked out of that room with me. That man, I now understood, had never really existed. He was a character I had co-authored, a projection of my own hopes. I grieved for him as if he were dead, and in a way he was. After 2 days of silence, I did not call one of the pre-approved attorneys on Eleanor's list. Instead, I did my own research just as I would for any historical project. I was looking for a specific kind of lawyer. Not a bulldog, not a flashy litigator, but a strategist. Someone meticulous, someone who understood the subtle language of power and the intricate architecture of legal documents. My search led me to a name, Anya Sharma. Her biography said she specialized in complex marital contracts and estate law, but it was the testimonials that caught my eye. Clients described her as impossibly sharp, a brilliant tactician, and someone who sees the entire chessboard. Her office was in a restored heritage building, a place that immediately put me at ease. It was filled with books, modern art, and an air of quiet, confident intelligence. Anya Sharma herself was a woman in her late 40s, with striking silver streaks in her dark hair, intelligent, piercing eyes behind stylish glasses, and a calm, centered demeanor. She listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, from the first meeting with Julian to the horrifying details of the prenup. I didn't cry. My voice was as steady and factual as if I were presenting a historical report. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingertips steepled under her chin. She looked at the binder on her desk as if it were a venomous snake. "This," she said finally, her voice low and even, "is one of the most punitive, insulting, and maliciously crafted documents I have ever seen. It's not a prenuptial agreement. It's a bill of sale." A wave of validation washed over me. I wasn't being oversensitive. This was as ugly as I thought it was. "My first piece of advice, Ms. Hayes," she continued, leaning forward, "is to take this document, throw it in an incinerator, and walk away from this man and his monstrous family. You deserve infinitely better." I met her gaze. "I know. And a week ago I would have. But that would be letting them win. They want to erase me, to prove I'm a worthless little nobody they can just discard. They believe their wealth and power make them untouchable. I cannot, in good conscience, let them be right." Anya studied my face, a flicker of something new in her eyes, respect, perhaps, or recognition. "So you don't want to run?" "No," I said. "I want to fight. But I want to fight on my own terms. In my own way. They think this is their game, their rules. I want to use their own rulebook against them." A slow, deliberate smile touched Anya's lips. It was a smile of pure intellectual delight. "I see," she said. "This is no longer about a wedding. This is a strategic campaign. I like a strategic campaign. So what is our objective?" "They are obsessed with their legacy," I explained, the archivist in me taking over, laying out the facts. "They are arrogant. They believe they are smarter than everyone else, especially me. They won't read the fine print of anything they believe is in their favor. They'll just look for the clauses that prove they've won. Our objective is to let them think they've won completely and utterly. I will agree to everything. The wait clause, the social calendar, quitting my job. I will be the most compliant, perfect future daughter-in-law they could ever dream of. I will sign their humiliating document." Anya raised an eyebrow. "You'll sign this?" "I'll sign a version of it," I corrected. "A version that has one small addition. A clause so carefully worded, so buried in legalese, and so tailored to their own arrogance that they won't even see it. A clause that will lie dormant like a seed until the time is right." For the next 2 weeks, Anya Sharma's office became my sanctuary and my war room. We became collaborators, architects of a future they could not foresee. We pored over the Ashworth family's public financial records, their business holdings, their philanthropic endeavors. We analyzed the language of the prenup, identifying its structure, its cadence, its specific legal jargon. "The key," Anya said during one of our late-night sessions, surrounded by takeout containers and legal textbooks, "is not to add something that looks like it benefits you. It has to look like it benefits them. It has to reinforce their sense of control and superiority." And that's when the idea came to me, born from their own words. Legacy, dilution, protection. "They're terrified of their assets being diluted, as Richard put it," I said, pacing her office. "They see me as a threat to their existing fortune. So we'll play on that. We'll help them protect it." Together, we began to draft what we internally called the legacy clause. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. The original document had endless clauses about me waiving my rights to their existing trusts, properties, and companies, all of which were named. Our new clause, which we would insert into a dense, boring section about the definition of separate property, would appear to strengthen this. The clause we drafted was long, convoluted, and filled with the kind of mind-numbing jargon that makes even lawyers' eyes glaze over. But at its core, it stated something very simple. It began by reiterating in excruciating detail that all pre-existing Ashworth family assets, trusts, and entities, as listed in Appendix A, would forever remain the sole and separate property of the Ashworth family. This was the bait. It looked like we were just reinforcing their primary goal. But then, buried in a subsection, came the hook. It was a single, carefully crafted sentence. It read, "Furthermore, in the interest of preserving the integrity of the aforementioned Ashworth family legacy, should any new corporate entity, holding company, or financial trust be established by the Ashworth family or its agents subsequent to the date of the marriage for the purpose of managing assets acquired during the marital term, and should the marriage be dissolved for any reason other than a legal finding of fault or breach on the part of the wife, Elara Hayes, said newly formed entities and the assets contained within shall be considered a product of the marital partnership and will be subject to a standard 50-50 division as marital property, notwithstanding any other provision in this agreement. It was perfect. Anya read it over and over, a look of profound admiration on her face. My God, Elara, it's a work of art. Do you think they'll see it? I asked, my heart pounding. Never, she said with a confident shake of her head. First, their arrogance is a shield against due diligence. They're looking for what you're trying to take, not what you're giving them. This clause looks like you're giving them the power to create new shelters for their money. Second, the trigger is key. Any new corporate entity established subsequent to the date of the marriage. It doesn't affect anything they have now. It only affects the hypothetical future. In their minds, they'll control that future, so it's a non-issue. Third, the language product of the marital partnership sounds like standard boilerplate. They'll skim right over it. They'll see the first part about protecting their legacy and the part about it only triggering if you're not at fault, and they'll think it's just another way of ensuring you behave. It's brilliant. It uses their own obsession with creating new, complex financial structures to set the trap. The plan was in place. Anya's firm retyped the entire document, so it was visually identical to the original, but with our legacy clause seamlessly integrated into the section on separate property definitions. It was a Trojan horse, beautiful in its lethal subtlety. I called Julian. My voice was contrite, sad, and defeated. I told him I had had time to think. I told him I loved him more than my pride, and that if signing the paper was what it took to be his wife, I would do it. I told him my lawyer had reviewed it and that, while she wasn't happy, she had confirmed it was legally sound. The relief in his voice was palpable, and it disgusted me. He wasn't relieved because our love had conquered an obstacle. He was relieved because he had avoided a difficult confrontation with his parents. He had chosen the path of least resistance, never once suspecting that path was leading him, and his entire family, off a cliff. The signing was arranged for the following week, back in the same sterile conference room. This time I was not the terrified, trembling woman who had fled in tears. I was an actress giving the performance of a lifetime. I dressed simply, in a gray dress that was elegant but understated. My hair was pulled back, my makeup minimal. I looked subdued, beaten. I played my part to perfection. Eleanor and Richard were smug, their victory so complete they were almost magnanimous. Eleanor even gave my arm a little pat that was meant to be reassuring. I knew you'd make the sensible choice, dear, she said. This is for the best for everyone. Julian sat beside me, holding my hand, his face radiating a foolish, boyish happiness. He thought he had his cake and could eat it too. He had his family's approval, and he had me, the compliant, tamed version of the woman he once loved. Anya was there, of course. She played her role as well, looking grim and slightly disapproving, the picture of a lawyer who has been forced to let her client sign a bad deal. My client is signing this against my strenuous advice, Anya said formally to the room, a statement that only served to inflate the Ashworths' egos further. Mr. Finch, their lawyer, pushed the revised document in front of me. It is the same document you reviewed previously, he said dismissively, not even bothering to look at it himself. He had no reason to. In his mind, the negotiation was over. This was just the paperwork. My heart was a cold, steady drum in my chest. I picked up the heavy, expensive fountain pen they provided. I could feel all their eyes on me. Eleanor's triumphant. Richard's satisfied. Julian's adoring and oblivious. I moved through the document, initialing the bottom of each page as instructed. My hand did not shake. My training as an archivist, my years of handling fragile, priceless documents with care and precision, served me well. I was calm. I was methodical. When I reached the page with our clause, I felt a slight flutter in my stomach, but I didn't slow down. I initialed it with the same steady hand and moved on. It was just one page among many. a single paragraph lost in a sea of text. Then I reached the final page. I took a deep breath and with a flourish that was only slightly less steady than I would have liked, I signed my name, Elara Hayes. The name of the woman they thought they had just purchased. A wave of relief washed over the room. Richard clapped his lawyer on the back. Eleanor smiled, a genuine reptilian smile of absolute victory. And Julian leaned over and kissed me, a soft, triumphant kiss. "I told you it would be okay," he whispered. "Now the future can begin." I smiled back at him, a placid, empty smile. "Yes," I said. "Now it can." As I watched them, so confident in their power, so assured of their victory, I felt a profound sense of calm. They had read the contract, but they had not read me. They saw a signature, but they did not see the intent behind it. They were celebrating the end of a negotiation. I was celebrating the beginning of a long, patient war. I had just signed away my freedom, and in doing so had laid the first perfect stone on the path to my liberation. The ink was dry. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait. My wedding was a grand affair. A production orchestrated entirely by Eleanor. It was less a celebration of love and more a display of Ashworth power and prestige. I walked down the aisle of a cathedral I didn't choose, in a dress that felt more like a costume, toward a man I no longer loved, only tolerated. Played my part. I smiled, I said my vows, and I allowed Julian to slip a heavy gold band on my finger. It felt less like a ring and more like a manacle. Life as Mrs. Julian Ashworth was a hollow performance. I resigned from my job at the Historical Society, an act that felt like a physical amputation. My days, once filled with the quiet purpose of my work, were now a carefully managed schedule of obligations set by my mother-in-law. Luncheons with women whose conversations revolved around staff problems and European ski trips. Charity committee meetings where my opinions were politely ignored. Fittings for gowns to be worn at galas where I stood by Julian's side, a silent, smiling accessory. I was living in a gilded cage, and the bars were polished to a brilliant shine. Julian, blissfully unaware, believed we were happy. He mistook my compliance for contentment. He saw my vacant smiles and heard my agreeable responses, and thought he had succeeded in bridging the two worlds. He had no idea I had simply abandoned his, and was now living in a third secret world inside my own mind. In this secret world, I was still an archivist. But my subject was no longer 19th century poets. My subject was the Ashworth family. I played the role of the dutiful, slightly naive daughter-in-law to perfection. I would ask my father-in-law, Richard, simple-minded questions about the family business during our stilted Sunday dinners. "Oh, that sounds so complicated," I'd say with wide-eyed innocence. "How do you ever keep track of it all?" Men like Richard Ashworth love nothing more than to explain their own brilliance to someone they perceive as less intelligent. And so, he would pontificate. He'd talk about market trends, about acquisitions, about the clever ways they structured their deals to minimize tax liabilities. He'd mention shell corporations and holding companies. I would listen, nod, and commit every single word to memory. With Eleanor, I was her shadow. I helped her plan parties, addressing invitations and coordinating with florists. In doing so, I gained access to her social network, her private calendars, and the intricate web of influence she wielded. I learned who was in their inner circle, who they trusted, and who they merely used. With Julian, I was the perfect supportive wife. I'd listen to his work frustrations, his anxieties about living up to his father's expectations. He was involved in the new ventures arm of the family empire, tasked with identifying and acquiring modern companies to diversify their old money portfolio. He would come home, pour himself a scotch, and complain about the due diligence on a new tech startup or the negotiations for a boutique hotel chain. I would rub his shoulders, murmur sympathetically, and absorb every detail. I was his confidant, his wailing wall. And all the while I was gathering data. Every night, after Julian fell asleep, I would retreat to the small study they had assigned me in our sprawling, joyless penthouse apartment. They thought it was where I read my society magazines. In reality, it was my intelligence hub. I had a private, encrypted laptop. On it, I maintained a meticulous cross-reference database. Every company name Richard mentioned, every deal Julian discussed, Every new asset I overheard them celebrating it all went into the file. I set up news alerts. I read trade publications. I became an expert on the Ashworth empire, from its foundations to its newest acquisitions. I was building an archive of their downfall. About a year into our marriage it happened, just as Anya and I had predicted. At another stilted family dinner, Richard made a proud announcement. "As you all know," he began, beaming, "our portfolio has grown significantly this past year, thanks in no small part to Julian's hard work." He gave Julian a rare, approving nod, and Julian preened like a schoolboy. "The old structures are becoming cumbersome. For tax purposes and for the clarity of our legacy, Eleanor and I have decided, with our lawyers, to establish a new, single entity to hold all the assets we have acquired since the wedding." My heart gave a single hard thud. I kept my face a perfect mask of pleasant incomprehension. "We're calling it the Ashworth Generational Trust," Eleanor added, her voice laced with satisfaction. "A clean, modern structure to carry our legacy into the future. It will hold the tech company, the hotel group, the new art acquisitions, everything. It separates the new growth from the foundational family wealth. It's the ultimate protection." She looked at me when she said that last part, a glint of triumph in her eye. She thought this new trust was the final lock on the vault, an extra layer of legal armor to keep me, the little gold digger, away from their new toys. She had no idea she had just handed me the key. Julian turned to me, his face glowing. "Isn't that brilliant, darling? A whole new trust for our generation." "It sounds very sensible," I said, taking a delicate sip of water. Inside my mind was racing. Ashworth Generational Trust. I had the name. The trap had a target. I excused myself from the table a few minutes later and went to the powder room. I locked the door and pulled out my phone. My fingers flew as I typed a short, encrypted message to Anya Sharma. They did it. "It's called the Ashworth Generational Trust. The seed has been planted." Her reply came back in less a minute. "Excellent. Now we let it grow. Stay patient. Your time will come." Patience became my mantra. I watched for 2 more years as the Ashworth Generational Trust swelled. It was like a parasite, feeding on the success of the new ventures Julian brought in. A biotech firm, a portfolio of commercial real estate, a luxury brand. Every new success, every dollar of profit was funneled into this new entity. It grew into a behemoth, a testament to the Ashworths' continued success, and in their minds a fortress I could never touch. They were so proud of it. Richard would boast about its performance at family gatherings. It was the symbol of their modern, forward-thinking dynasty. During this time I continued to play my part. I adhered to the clauses of the prenup with a placid obedience that they mistook for fear. I kept my weight within the prescribed range. I submitted my budgets to Eleanor. I smiled and nodded at social functions. I was the perfect porcelain doll. But the performance took its toll. There were nights I would lie awake next to the sleeping form of my husband and feel a profound, aching loneliness. I had given up my friends, my career, my identity. I was a ghost in my own life. Sometimes the sheer weight of the deception felt crushing. I would look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. What if I failed? What if, after all this, they had found a loophole? The fear was a constant, cold companion. My anchor in this storm was my father. We spoke every day. I never told him the full extent of my plan. I couldn't risk worrying him, but he knew I was unhappy. He could hear it in my voice. He never judged me. He just listened, and he would end every call the same way. "Remember who you are, Ilara. You are a historian. You understand that the arc of history is long. Be patient. And remember you are loved." His voice was the one true thing in my false world. The final straw, the event that finally triggered the endgame, came 3.5 years into the marriage. My father passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack in his sleep. The grief was a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs and shattering the careful composure I had maintained for so long. Julian was kind in his limited way. He was there for the funeral. His parents sent an ostentatiously large wreath and a brief, formal note of condolence. A few weeks later, my father's lawyer contacted me. My father had lived a simple life, but he had been a careful man. He had left me his apartment, his book collection, and a life insurance policy that amounted to a modest but not insignificant sum of money. It was enough to give me a fresh start, a small measure of independence. It was his last gift to me. I was discussing the details with Julian one evening, explaining that I planned to use the money to set up a small charitable foundation in my father's name to support young writers. It felt like the perfect way to honor him. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, darling, that's a lovely idea. But managing something like that can be complicated. My father and I were talking, and we think the wisest thing to do would be to roll that inheritance into the Ashworth Generational Trust." I stared at him. "What did you say?" "It's for the best," he said, completely oblivious to the storm gathering in my eyes. "The trust has the best financial managers. They can make that money grow so much faster. It will be protected, and you can still use the profits for your foundation. It's just a more sensible way to handle it." Dad said he'd have Mr. Finch draw up the papers. That was it. That was the moment. They were not content with taking my future. Now they wanted to absorb my past. They wanted to take my father's legacy, the last pure and good thing I had, and swallow it into their corrupt, monstrous machine. They wanted to put my grief, my love for my father, onto their balance sheet. The insult was so profound, so complete, it transcended anger. It became a pure, cold certainty. I looked at my husband, at this weak, foolish man who was so utterly a product of his upbringing that he could not see the violation he was proposing. I felt nothing for him. Not love, not hate. Just a vast, empty pity. "That's a very interesting idea, Julian," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Let me think about it." That night I did not sleep. I sat in my study and looked out over the glittering, sleeping city. I thought of my father, of his kindness and his integrity. I thought of the woman I was before I met the Ashworths, the woman who found joy in the quiet rustle of old paper. They had tried to erase her. They had failed. An archivist knows that nothing is ever truly erased. It just gets buried. And I knew exactly where everything was buried. The next morning, I went to my closet and put on a dark, impeccably tailored suit that I had bought and hidden away for this very day. I did my hair and makeup not as the subdued Mrs. Ashworth, but as Alara Hayes. When I looked in the mirror, I saw her looking back at me for the first time in years. Her eyes were older, harder, but they were clear. I walked into the living room. Julian was drinking coffee and reading the financial news. He looked up at me, a strange expression on his face. "Wow, you look different. Are you going somewhere?" "Yes," I said, my voice ringing with the clarity that made him put down his paper. "I am going to see my lawyer. And then I am going to leave you." The final act was swift and silent. I met with Anya that morning. I walked into her office and she looked up from her desk and smiled. "I saw the suit," she said. "I take it the time has come." "They tried to take my father's inheritance," I said simply. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Then let's burn them to the ground." Within hours, the process was in motion. A courier was dispatched to the offices of Ashworth, Sterling, and Finch. He delivered a single, thick envelope. It contained the formal notice of my filing for divorce. The reaction, as Anya predicted, was immediate and contemptuous. Richard Ashworth called me himself, something he had never done before. He didn't yell. He was worse. He was amused. "Alara," he chuckled, a rich, condescending sound. "I have your little letter here. I must say I'm disappointed. I thought you were smarter than this. Have you forgotten the agreement you signed? Or do you just have a particularly incompetent lawyer? You're going to walk away with next to nothing, you foolish girl." "I have an excellent lawyer, Richard," I said calmly. "And I suggest you have yours reread the agreement you were so proud of. Page 27. Section 4, Subclass C. Have a lovely day." I hung up. The meeting was set for a week later, in the same conference room where my humiliation had been sealed. The stage was the same, but the actors had changed roles. This time I was not the victim. I was the executioner. I walked in with Anya by my side. The entire Ashworth clan was there. Richard, Eleanor, and Julian. Their lawyer, Mr. Finch, looked flustered, papers spread out in front of him. The air of smug superiority was gone, replaced by a tense, confused anger. "What is the meaning of this farce?" Eleanor demanded, her voice tight with rage. "What is this nonsense about page 27?
Anya smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile.
She sat down opposite them and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a copy of the legacy clause. "This, Mrs. Ashworth, is the meaning of this farce," Anya said. "My client, Alara Hayes, is filing for divorce, as the dissolution of the marriage was not initiated by her, nor is there any finding of fault or breach on her part. This clause is now in effect." Richard snatched the paper. He read it, his face slowly turning from ruddy to a pale, sickly white. He passed it to Mr. Finch, who was already sweating. This is absurd," Finch stammered, shuffling his own copy of the agreement. "This clause, I don't recall this clause." "I'm sure you don't," Anya said coolly. "You were so focused on what your clients were taking, you didn't bother to read what my client was giving you. You were in such a hurry to celebrate your victory, you didn't check the text of the final document you had your opponent sign. A sloppy, fatal mistake." Eleanor stared at the paper, her aristocratic mask finally cracking. Disbelief warred with horror on her face. "The Ashworth Generational Trust? It's its marital property. According to the contract you wrote and my client signed, yes," Anya confirmed. "A newly formed entity, established subsequent to the marriage, to hold assets acquired during the marital term. Fits the definition perfectly. As per the terms you yourselves drafted, my client is entitled to a standard 50-50 division of all assets held within that trust." A dead silence fell over the room. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart, a triumphant rhythm. Richard finally found his voice. It was a strangled whisper. "Everything? The tech company? The hotels? The real estate portfolio?"
Anya nodded.
"Everything. We've already done a preliminary valuation. The trust currently holds assets valued at approximately $950 million. My client is claiming her half, $475 million. Eleanor made a sound, a strangled gasp, and one hand went to her pearls. For the first time I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in her eyes. The fear of a queen whose castle has just been turned to sand. And Julian just stared at me. His face was a canvas of utter, soul-crushing devastation. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed horror of a man who has just realized the game he thought he was winning was, in fact, over before it even began. "Alara, why?" he whispered, his voice broken. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in a long time. I felt no anger, no triumph, just a profound, sorrowful emptiness. "You asked me to sign a paper that dictated my weight, my friends, and my career, Julian. You watched your parents humiliate me and called it a formality. You tried to take the last thing my father gave me and absorb it into your machine. You asked me why. You never once in all this time chose me. You chose your legacy. Well, this is my legacy. The woman you underestimated. The archivist who keeps very, very good records." I stood up. Anya stood with me. My part in this drama was over. "You'll be hearing from my legal team with the settlement details," Anya said to the stunned, silent room. I walked toward the door. As I passed Julian, he reached out, his hand grabbing my arm. "Please," he begged, tears welling in his eyes. "Don't do this. I love you." I gently removed his hand from my arm. "No, Julian," I said, my voice soft but final. "You loved the idea of me. You loved a woman you could control. You never knew me at all." I walked out of that conference room and didn't look back. I stepped out of the building into the bright, clear afternoon, and for the first time in years, I took a deep breath and felt truly free. The weight wasn't gone. It had simply been transferred. They tried to fight it, of course. They dragged it through the courts for months, but the contract was ironclad. It was their own language, their own logic turned against them. They lost. In the end, they had to liquidate a massive portion of their new empire to pay the settlement. The Ashworth Generational Trust was gutted, a hollow shell of their ambition. Their reputation in the financial world was shattered, not just by the loss, but by the sheer embarrassing foolishness of how it had happened. They had been outmaneuvered by the quaint little archivist they had so thoroughly disdained. I never saw them again. I used a portion of the money to establish the most well-funded literary foundation in the country, in my father's name. I used another portion to buy the historical society where I used to work, which was struggling financially, ensuring its future and the safety of the stories it held. The rest? The rest I invested quietly and carefully. I did not do it for the money. I did it for the justice. I did it to reclaim the narrative. They tried to write my story for me, to cast me as a minor silent character in their grand family saga. But I am an archivist. I know that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is written by the patient, by the observant, by the one who reads the fine print. And in my version of the story, I was not the damsel in distress, or the victim, or the gold digger. I was the historian who documented the fall of a dynasty. My story is a quiet one, but it is my own. And it is a reminder that sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is not a loud, fiery explosion, but the silent, inevitable click of a perfectly executed plan. Thank you for listening to her revenge arc. My story had a very specific contractual form of justice. But justice can take many forms. So I want to ask you, have you ever had to play the long game to reclaim your own story, or find your own sense of peace? What does it truly mean to win when the battle has been so personal? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and reclamation. Until next time, be the author of your own story.